Welcome to episode 194 of the Security Weekly News. This is the wrap-up show for the week of 6 March 2022 at our new time at 11 a.m. Eastern Time in the United States. Today we got war, of course, again, supply chains, certs, the Ukraine IT Army malware, BazarBackdoor, some scary studies. Walter Cronkite stars as PewDiePie, and all the show wrap-ups on the Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more. Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda.
All right, I'm Doug White, and this is the Security Weekly News wrap-up show for this week. On Application Security Weekly number 187, John and Mike first did the AppSec news this week. And in the second segment, Liban Chang, the head of API security at Imperva, was on the show. Liban was on to talk about API traffic, and this ended up sort of being a basis for me doing a kind of rant later about this, but basically, we're talking about API traffic and how attackers understand this maybe better than a lot of us do in terms of how they're going to target APIs rather than targeting companies directly, because if they can create supply chain attacks by building things into, API lambdas and all these kind of things, then, it gets really complicated and it's hard for anybody to discern. They also talked about the Imperva API security product, which is an interesting product, and it's a very huge issue that we've all talked about quite a bit on various shows. On Business Security Weekly number 253, Jason, Matt, and Tyler Robinson had Michael McPherson, a product marketer at ExtraHop, on the show. Michael was on talking about new approaches to cybersecurity, and there's been a lot of stories I've seen lately about, cybersecurity is not working, the way we're doing cybersecurity is not working, and so on. And so this was a pretty interesting segment. But Michael was talking about the tactical questions that security leadership needs to be asking in order to build a better defensive profile. It really is a pretty interesting subject, and it kind of calls out the way we've been doing things for a while. So to me, anytime people are calling out what you're doing, I think it's worth looking at and seeing, maybe they have a point. So definitely check that out. In the second segment, the Business Security News. On Enterprise Security Weekly 264, Adrian, Katie, and Tyler had Jeff Stiles, the Senior Vice President of Global Field Sales and Field CISO at Firemon, on. And this definitely was a favorite topic of mine, just based on historical experience. The topic was about how to audit firewall rules, and how that could be a very difficult thing. And having audited firewall rules, I can attest that, yes, it is very difficult, especially if it's not your firewall. But even if it's yours, it can be difficult. And you may have hundreds and hundreds of firewall rules that you're trying to evaluate. And over time, it gets really hard. People put them in, they take them out. It's really tough to tell what's going on there. But they talked about how you can automate this kind of review, and how, and in particular, they were talking about how to be in compliance with PCI DSS. But just in general, I mean, that's always been a kind of a bear for everybody. In the second segment, Andrew Morris, the founder and CEO at Gray Noise Intelligence, was on. And to talk about how Gray Noise got started and how they're trying to filter some of the noise out of cybersecurity products. and they were talking about how they had looked at 10,000 plus cybersecurity products that are all out there trying to get your attention and to get you to buy that product. Very interesting segment, actually, to me. In the third segment, the Enterprise Security News was on. On Security Weekly News, number 193 this week, Jason Wood was talking about vigilante bug bounties that were particularly targeting Russia. So there had been a call for people to actually go target Russian things and document this. And pretty interesting to hear Jason's opinion about that. So check that one out, too. On Paul's Security Weekly, number 731 on Wednesday night, first up was Daniel Trauner, the Senior Director of Security at Axonius. The segment was about getting back to basics and how that despite all the shiny new products, again, a la that Enterprise Security Weekly segment I was talking about before, how you really do need to just focus on the key basic issues of security. And there's several stories I put in the news segment on this show today because of this segment. Which these were studies that have been done that really were almost shocking to me. But when I was listening to this segment the other night, it made me rethink some of this, so it's worth checking out. On the second segment, Antranik Vartanian, the CEO at Illyria Security Inc., was on. Antranik is an OS developer and was on talking about something also near and dear to my heart. It was a good week for me. Unix and Linux. We had firewalls, and we got Unix and Unix-like products like Linux. But Antranik was on talking about this, and they were talking about how these systems are rooted, and were developed. I'm sorry, rooted, no pun intended. Rooted in the old insecure world, and how as they become so heavily adopted in the cloud, and Unix development and so forth has affected it, that the old ideas are affecting the overall security state. And again, this was so relevant to some of the other stuff I'm going to talk about in a little while about security through obscurity and so forth. And in the third segment, they had security news, which did include this week David Marble, the CEO of Ocean, which is based here in Rhode Island, and they have an upcoming security conference at Bryant University on March 15th, I think, so which is a free conference if you're interested in attending. My thread of the week was driven sort of by that earlier story, and I'm calling it channel dependence. And you've heard me talk about this before. I mean, I talk about it all the time. But the tweet that I attached about the war was talking about how the Russian army knocked down cell towers in the Ukraine. And when they did that, and they were doing that while they weren't blowing up hospitals and orphanages and stuff, but how all this led to them having to use insecure channels to communicate because a key system that they had called ERA was no longer working. So they basically just used old-fashioned, like, local SIM cards that they probably took out of somebody's phone, and they were actually calling in information in the clear, and it was all intercepted. And so there was a thing about how they were reporting that this major general was killed, and all that got picked up by various people who were monitoring these things, and it ended up being a big news story. But read that article too. And I wasn't really going to talk about the Russians here, but I was very interested in our dependence on specific systems and this channel dependence that we're starting to see more and more. And every day it seems like we get to this point where single point of failure kind of issues can end up being a deciding factor in whether or not you're going to be online this year. And with the cloud and the cloud's sort of increasingly sneaky way of filtering into every system, room, device, IoT device, IIoT device, we're really very rapidly moving into a scenario. And it's a scenario that we all talked about years and years ago. But at the time, it wasn't really a huge issue. And we got a lot of pushback saying, oh, come on, Doug, these elaborate scenarios are never going to happen. We're not that dependent on this interweb thing and so on. But what I was talking about even way back then was how an outage could basically result in total chaos. I mean, as Skynet grows, to be a bigger and bigger part of our world, we pretty much rely on Skynet for everything. And so a few years ago, as an example, there was a hurricane. And it was going to hit New York City, and my friends were saying that the police were driving through their neighborhood, announcing on the loudspeaker that you should evacuate, and that you should go to this website that they were reading out to see where to evacuate and how to evacuate and so forth. Okay, well, the police were doing their job. And, and my friends, of course, jump on this website to see what they're supposed to do. And the website had crashed. So they're getting a 404 error on this critical website that the police are out in the street right then saying, go to this website, go to this website. And the website was down because so many people were going to the website. And guess what? That starts to give you a really, really uneasy feeling, right? As a second example, when I used to travel a lot in Europe and other countries, I had all these maps and notes and books of notes about various cities. Like I have all these notes about Nanjing, China, and places I used to go. And I had stuff marked on the maps, like here's where I like to buy noodles, and here's where I like to buy baozi and all this kind of stuff. And, and I had all that information. And this is not, so it's not one of these kids today rant. So it's not. It's really more of we really need to adapt, how we do things today because it gets a little scary. And, with all my maps, I could, say I'm in Munich again, and here's my maps with cool stuff marked. Here's where I like to buy this sandwich that I really enjoyed or whatever. But, and I could do that with other tools. So as those tools became available, I started doing all that. And, and I got more dependent on that. And I started putting, pins and maps and whatever. And, it's sort of the same effect. It's virtual. But I was walking the street in Paris with my daughter. And I just kind of, that disaster part of me started thinking, we don't even know the address of the building we're staying in. We were staying in an apartment. And I was like, I didn't know what district it was in. I didn't know what street it was on. I didn't know anything. It was all on my phone. I mean, I could look it up, but, and I started wondering, I wondered how often the Paris police get calls from tourists saying, my phone was stolen. I don't know where I'm staying. I don't speak French. I don't even know the number of anybody to call. Like when my friend Lou got hurt and he was taken to the hospital, they didn't take his cell phone. They just took him. And he didn't know any numbers. He couldn't remember what town even I lived in. He knew my name, but he couldn't remember what the town was where I lived, and this was far away from here. And he didn't know anything. And they thought, he was, that he had got brain damage or something, but, he didn't have any family or anything. So they didn't know what to do. And he finally remembered the name of his cat's vet. And they called the vet, and the hospital social worker called the vet, and they looked up and they went to his house and they broke in and got his cat and took it to the cat clinic and got his cell phone, which had my number in it, and then he was able to call me. That was like 3 days later that they finally got all that organized. So as enterprises, we kind of have this same problem. As we start to see that our customer service site has a back-end database that relies on joins that link into the cloud database, and they do call this the fog, by the way. I learned that last year. And, maybe you got Lambdas, maybe you got APIs, maybe you got all this kind of stuff that are sitting in the cloud, and those things are all linked together too, right? So the API has an API, which you've heard me say before. And I think we're really very quickly moving towards situations where we rely on, all kinds of things in the cloud, like a cloud-based AI that analyzes data that's coming in and decides who's going to deal with it and so forth. And then there's an emergency in, Indonesia, and that emergency, a tsunami in Indonesia or a volcano causes something to be down, and the cloud-based AI just happened to be based there and is now offline. And that could actually lead to this sort of, essentially just an avalanche of things failing all the way around the world. And all of a sudden, you're basically doing one of those payphone calls that we've all done, where you're calling on a landline and it says, if your internet service is out, please go to our website to report the outage. Thank you. I mean, I really had that. I literally heard that once. I called in on a landline and it said, if your internet service is not working, please go to our website to report. I was like, what? How am I supposed to do that? And, and as this stuff gets more intertwined, it may be just like this exponential threat where your cell system backup relies on a cloud-based feature, just like the main feature and the main system. So I guess my point is, as you do your continuity audits, and you do continuity audits, right? And you do continuity brainstorming, right? You'll see from these surveys I've gotten in the news that you probably don't. But you may want to think a little further along the supply chain. It's really easy to say, yeah, we locked all the doors here in the factory, but there's a lot of other doors now. And, when I used to write these exercises for people, I kind of knew what they would do, and I wrote accordingly. So, I would say something like, okay, the building just got sucked into a black hole by the Centaurian fleet. what's the first step you take? And inevitably, they always said, well, I pull out the old red binder here and I call, let's see, Dave Miller at 555-1212, and he activates the level 3 alert system. And I go, okay, you try to call, the phone says, sorry, there's no service. What do you do then? And, I remember this very specific one. We have a backup plan where there's a two-way radio system that we use to contact him. And I was like, really? Well, the batteries are dead. Since I actually see it over there in the case, and I think the batteries are literally dead. We checked it last week when we were testing stuff. And they were like, you have spare batteries, right? And they're like, oh, no, I guess we'll run to Best Buy for parts during the Sontarrian invasion. But my cell phone's down, and I don't know where the nearest Best Buy is. Is that a sonic screwdriver in your pocket? No. Well, I see you don't get all my if you don't get all my clever Doctor Who references, well, so what? Anyway, that also needs to be corrected. But anyway, spin forward to the Sontarrian invasion of 2024, and now the cloud servers are sucked into a black hole. What stops? Can you open the front door of the building even? Does anybody actually have a physical key? Some guy named Hervé who lives where? It's on the contact list on your phone that doesn't work, that was stored in the cloud. So I think you probably get the idea from me ranting on about this for so long. But I think that your threat surface is rapidly expanding. And in the next few years, it's going to expand even more. And you're going to have to start thinking downstream and upstream beyond your own borders if you really want to understand your threat surface very soon, because this threat surface increase is going to create an exponential number of potential linkages that are all going to be out there, and they're all going to lead back to some guy named Bert in Staten Island that runs a meta lambda function that runs it all, that everybody thought was really just some sort of Skynet, but it was really just Bert and his Raspberry Pi server. So we probably need to start thinking down that stream, and I really want us to. Not just outside the box, but way beyond the box, and all those other boxes over there, and maybe some of those boxes that were stored down there. It's just not as simple as an old AS400 with a bunch of Twinix connectors. I mean, that was a lot simpler, and we're not there anymore. So, yeah. And now the news. So Russia created a TLS certificate authority. Since most everyone in the world, except for, say, some U.S. Congress people and stuff that are just, loving on Russia, most everybody in the world is now refusing to do business with the Russians since they invaded the Ukraine. Russian sites that had already been having problems since they couldn't renew their certs that are used to validate those websites are now not available. So they can't get to their certificate authorities that they're paying to give them certificates. The Ministry of Digital Development said they're developing a domestic certificate so that they can independently issue certs. So essentially a self-signed cert. But currently, all the main browsers display large warnings or even full-page block warning that the site you're trying to reach has no cert, and as such, well, you probably shouldn't go there. So a lot of people probably wouldn't click on through. Most of the cert authorities have blocked business with the Russians. So when their certs expire, they will all get warnings posted by all the main browsers. Now, that isn't really the end of the problem, or we'd all just set up CAs and certify ourselves, and basically certs would be worthless. But the browsers have to agree to trust the issuing authority. And that's going to be a real problem for these new Russian domestic cert authorities, because they're probably not going to do that vetting very quickly. So currently only Yandex, which is the Russian browser, and Atom have accepted this Russian cert. The Russian government is advising citizens to, you guessed it, only use Yandex or Atom browsers. And you can, of course, manually add certs to your browser if you really want a Russian-issued cert, of course. But, if you should probably be a little careful about that, because when you do put other people's certs that are not vetted into your browsers, they can actually use their root certificate authority to intercept your encrypted traffic and perform man-in-the-middle attacks on you. So if you need to access any of the Russian banks, well, it's probably Yandex for now, but, enjoy. Speaking of Russia, a new malware app is targeting the Ukrainian IT Army supporters, which includes lots of people in the United States. In February, the Ukrainian government asked for worldwide volunteers to join their IT Army, as they call it, to conduct cyber attacks and denial of service campaigns against Russian entities. And a lot of people signed up for that. Now, as a large number of people want to do something against the Russians and are doing stuff, including some of our friends who are actually doing kinetic stuff, but people that want to do virtual stuff, well, guess what? There's now threat actors, who could, of course, be Russian, providing fake distributed denial of service tools on Telegram. The one that they're providing currently is actually a credential stealer, which you load on your system while you're eagerly trying to start attacking Russia. The site is mimicking a tool called Liberator, which is an actual DDoS tool, but this is actually a fake DDoS tool for Liberator. The report came from Cisco Talos. The versions of Liberator that are from the original site are clean, according to Talos, but be careful if you're downloading tools, which is always good advice. But if you download hacking tools, and you probably know this already, but you definitely want to beware. The malware that they're using is called Phoenix, and it's been around since like 2019, and it's basically an information stealer that is sold in the dark web currently as malware as a service. It has an $80 charge for a lifetime subscription, so and it's cheap, it's easy to get, and they're actually embedding this in a fake Liberator. And I certainly cannot endorse anybody taking actions that are illegal in your locale. So if you do decide to join the Ukrainian IT Army, be very cautious. Use virtual machines to vet stuff you download. If you're downloading any sort of malware or wares or any of this kind of stuff. And I mean, like I say, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but we all know that if you start downloading things, you yourself may end up being attacked or compromised, anytime, whether involves the Russians or not. We talked about Conti ransomware gang on a previous show, but CISA has updated their alert from they had an alert a couple of weeks ago about them and the indicators of compromise for Conti. Now, their original Conti advisory was all the way back in September of last year, and they were talking about Conti targeting U.S. organizations and so forth, and we reported on that. But they had recently mentioned them again and how that they were doing a lot of new stuff. And they have a new update about this from the U.S. Secret Service. So Conti announced at the end of February, last week, that they were siding with Russia, which resulted in them basically ending up with a big mess because some of their members were actually Ukrainian, and a Ukrainian researcher who may or may not have been a member of Conti doxed a bunch of their messages and their source code and so forth. They later said they were apolitical, but, it's kind of hard to say you're apolitical when you just said you were political. It's kind of insincere. But anyway, the release by the doxing contained a lot of domains that had been using and showed that they had been using BazarBackdoor, or how, I don't know if you say Bazar or it's spelled like B-A-Z-A-R, but BazarBackdoor with Conti. And CISA now reports that Conti has hit more than 1,000 organizations around the world with TrickBot and Cobalt Strike, but they are now using BazarBackdoor as well. And CISA released 98 domain names today that seem to have similarities with other domains that Conti ransomware has used in the past. They did warn that some of these may just be coincidental, but you may want to add these domains to your block list. So they're all included in the article if you're interested. And speaking of BazarBackdoor, just a little more about that. This is a stealthy piece of code that used to be pushed out by phishing emails. So this was a traditional vector for BazarBackdoor. But, since we all have email filtering now and we've trained a lot of our users to maybe not just immediately click everything that they get, that email phishing vector blind has really declined, I guess, in effectiveness. Abnormal Security reported that a new campaign involving BazarBackdoor is now using corporate contact forms instead of the traditional email approach. So this is a big warning for all of us that receive inbound traffic from corporate forms. An initial finding showed that Conti actors, or at least presumably Conti, was posing as employees of a Canadian construction company, among other things, and they sent a request for a product quote to a manufacturing company. Basically what they did was the request provided all the details of their request for a quote in a file that would be downloaded from Transfer Now, which is a Dropbox-like service. And since the files are not email and they're not attached to email, and when they're downloaded by things like Transfer Now, they typically use HTTPS or some other encrypted protocol like SFTP, but it's probably HTTPS, SSL stuff. And that means that the email and other filters are not going to detect that. And so what happens is on this is that the encrypted files end up getting downloaded. And the payload then is further packed into an ISO, which is only unpacked when you get it on site and you double click it and you start unencrypting it and so forth. And so it's really hard to spot. So be very wary of attachments of any sort. And a lot of people switched over to Dropbox and Transfer Now and other things like that. So you might want to issue some updates to your training so that your salespeople and your contact people don't start opening these kind of attachments, which makes things difficult. In a rather sad study from HackerOne, 65% of organizations claimed that they want to be seen as infallible. And 64% of those same organizations who want to be infallible said they practice a culture of security through obscurity, meaning that if nobody knows that the bank vault is actually just made of cardboard, well, they won't break in, which is really stupid. 57% of the respondents to the study said they were struggling to create a cybersecurity culture, and only 26% said they were very confident that staff were actually following any sorts of security practice rules. Only 12% of the companies said that departments outside of IT and security actually made cyber awareness and training a core focus. About 63% of these respondents, also these infallible respondents, said they had a security breach due to staff avoiding security measures. Only 29% said that their boards were deeply involved in cybersecurity strategy, and 65% said that 65% said that security slowed innovation. But 63% of the organization said that they believe that cybersecurity is as important as cost when choosing a vendor. And 62% of these same people who don't have anything except obscurity as their defense said that if they saw a company, they would take their business elsewhere if the vendor had a data breach. Wow, talk about hypocrisy. And this is a really grim study I was just like, wow, not much has changed. The first pen test I ever did resulted in me getting called out by upper management and told that no good can possibly come of analyzing our security status, and that looking at it only encourages people to break in. Security through obscurity is so naive and foolish, but it's just this easy cop-out for management to go, oh yeah, we don't tell people we have all these weaknesses, they won't know about them. Right. And, add to this the elaborate hypocrisy of we can't stand it when our suppliers get breached, but we aren't doing anything about our own security because we're infallible. And it sounds like somebody needs to go into the CC with a squirt bottle and say, bad CISO, bad, no treats for you. Don't do this. Since we're doing sad studies anyway, I got to do one more. This one from Extra Hop showed that corporate leaders have a really false sense of security about their own organizations. The same people that say they want to be infallible. And they have a really bad sense about how ready they are. And I can certainly attest to this from audit. I never once got told, nope, we're totally screwed. We got nothing. No matter how bad their setup was. And sometimes it was bad. Like, they got a permit IP any rule right at the top of their ASA firewall list. Literally sitting right there. And when I saw that, I did ask the person, and they said, I don't really know what it means, but if you delete it, everything quits working. And we're pretty secure. We have an ASA, and that cost a pretty penny, let me tell you. And that high school kid, and I'm not making this up, we hired to set it up, is really smart. That really happened. Anyway, in the Extra Hop study, 69% of the respondents said they were still transmitting sensitive data over HTTP instead of HTTPS. 68% were still running, wait for it, SMB version 1. Yep. 77% of the responders were very or extremely confident in their setup, but 64% admitted that they had cybersecurity incidents as a result of their policies, and 85% reported at least one ransomware attack, with 74% of them having multiple ransomware attacks, because why not just keep attacking them since they actually have nothing? 48% of them said they paid the ransomware demanded most or all of the time. That's very scary to me, because it basically says nothing has changed. This is the exact same thing about security through obscurity nonsense. Come on. Really? Those two studies just freak me out. And finally, Walter Cronkite may be long dead. And if you're not sure who Walter Cronkite was, he was a very famous journalist who was nicknamed the most trusted man in America, who was one of the main people who was the face of covering the Vietnam War. Very, very famous and respected guy. But, and I know if you have to explain the joke, it's not really a joke anymore, and you probably just get college credit for listening or something like that. But much like a lot of other things in the world, Twitch streamers have sprung up to replace traditional news outlets. Yep. Trusted traditional news is at an all-time low. I don't care which side of this thing you're on. Everybody says the other side is lying, and often they seem to be pretty much on point. So we already watch other people make snarky comments while they play The Sims. Why not watch the war via Twitch with feedback and snarky comments and commentary turned up to full volume? I mean, the argument here is, and I guess it's not that invalid, is that the immediate feedback of the mob provides a more balanced presentation, since people screaming bullshit at you will keep you honest, which might be kind of true. I mean, I don't know if I totally agree with that, because sometimes the angry mob is not rational, and the people that are watching are only people who support your point of view, so they're always going to praise you when you lie about something and criticize you if you say something they don't like. I mean, how do you know she's a witch? Well, she has a wart. She turned me into a newt. You don't look like a newt. Well, I got better. I mean, if you've never seen that scene from Monty Python, well, you should watch it, because it kind of says everything you need to know about the current state of affairs. But these are very interesting if you like these kind of things, and most everybody does. I mean, you got people looking at all kinds of grainy footage and talking about what it means while the mob roars on in the background. And, I mean, it's kind of interesting. And I do feel like it works on video games. You see people calling out cheaters and all this kind of stuff, and they really enjoy watching other people do this. So, and we read viewer comments, and when we do read them, well, it enlightens me all the time. And I do get a better feel for what people are thinking, and often adjust what we're saying or doing because of people's point of view. So maybe this is the future of news, and PewDiePie is going to end up being the new Walter Cronkite in some kind of live stream of the war. It's interesting anyway. But that's the wrap-up for the week of 6 March 2022. I'm Doug White. I'll see you next week on the Security Weekly News.